In tug of war, there are two teams pulling one rope in opposite directions. And in the middle of the rope is usually tied something like a handkerchief, whatever, to determine the center of the rope, so that when one team pulls it far enough, that handkerchief, whatever's tied in the middle, indicates that one team has won tug of war. And in a really even match game, the rope is really tested. It's pulled back and forth as each team digs deeper for more strength, hoping to win. And for a moment, I want you to imagine what it would be like to be that rope. And now you know the feeling of trying to live a godly life in an ungodly world. So let's be clear. The world is ungodly and always has been. Romans 3:19 indicates that the whole world is guilty before God because of sin. Romans 5:12 teaches that because of sin, the world is under the curse of death. Listen to the words of Jesus about the world. In John 14:17, Jesus said, "The world cannot receive the Spirit of truth because it sees him not, neither knows him." In John 15, verse 18, "If the world hates you, know that it hated me before it hated you." And referring to his own death on the cross by crucifixion, Jesus said in John 16:20, "You will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice." The world was glad when Jesus died on the cross because it hated him. Friends, the world is ungodly, and it always has been. The Apostle Paul taught about the spiritual state of the world in Romans 3, verses 10 through 18, when he said, "There is no one righteous, no, not one. There is no one who understands. No one seeks after God. Everyone has gone out of the way. Everyone is altogether unprofitable. No one does anything good." Think about that. God says his evaluation of the world is that not one unbelieving person does anything good, anything of lasting spiritual value, because their throat is an open grave. They curse and speak bitter words from their mouths. They run to violence. They destroy and produce misery. They do not know what real peace is like, and ultimately, they do not fear God at all. That's the world, and that's the place where we live, and it's always been that way. We live in a kind of tug of war, don't we? Our world has hold of one arm, pulling us in, seeking to pull us down into hell. And praise God, he's on the other side of the rope, pulling us toward himself. And that's how we live, trying to live godly in an ungodly world, which can appear to look a little weird at times. It's just weird when Christians lie, isn't it? It's hard to watch a Christian completely lose his temper. What does it say about a Christian who steals from another person? Have you ever heard a Christian tell a dirty joke or say something really biting and sarcastic that you know hurts the feelings of someone else? Isn't that weird? Have you ever known a Christian to be a racist or be unforgiving? Well, that's strange, or it should be. What happens when the wrong side of the rope gets yanked really hard sometimes? When that happens, Christians can be hurtful, they can be angry, selfish, gossips, complainers, covetous, drunks. Christians can commit adultery. Christians can live in immoral uncleanness. And this is true because we all know our own hearts. We know the sinfulness that we have inside. And I think if we are going to be honest with ourselves, we need to first step back and realize that we live in an ungodly world. And then, how does God want us to live in that ungodly world? How can we live a godly life in an ungodly world? Would you consider with me, number one, we live in an ungodly world. Life brings opportunities to live among ungodly people. And if you look in chapter 33 of Genesis, beginning in verse 17, you find in this ending section of Genesis 33, Jacob is living life. He's doing a bunch of mundane things. He builds himself a house in Succoth, which includes a farm for his animals. He purchases land from the people of Canaan, which requires him to go to a man named Hamor and actually negotiate for the price of the land. Living here even includes worship, just part of Jacob's normal life. Wherever he is, he's going to build an altar to God. Here he builds an altar and he says that this altar is God is the God of Israel. That is, his name had been changed to Israel, and he says, God is my God. That's his altar. And that's just part of everyday life. And if you think about life, that's kind of how we are. Much of life is just filled with doing mundane things. I mean, I hope you brushed your teeth this morning. I hope you combed your hair. I hope that later you're going to cook yourself some food or maybe go out to the Baptist Steakhouse, McDonald's, right? I hope that you're just going to do all the mundane things you normally do to live. It's just part of life. You have to do them. It's just, some of them are uncomfortable sometimes. I mean, every night you have to go to sleep, don't you? You just have to. You really don't have a lot of choice in the matter. And then the next day, after sleeping for however long, God lets you sleep, you wake up, and then maybe your alarm wakes you up. Maybe the sunrise or the chatter outside of the birds wakes you up, and that's just life. It's all these mundane things. But this opportunity of living in this kind of world can lead to greater ungodliness. I want you to look at chapter 34. Let's begin reading in verse 1. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, which she bore unto Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. Kind of just normal life, normal living. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the country, saw her, he took her and lay with her and defiled her, and his soul clave. And this is a nice old English word here. He loved her. His soul desired her. Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, he loved the damsel. He spake kindly unto her. And Shechem spake unto the father of Hamor, unto his father Hamor, saying, Get me this damsel to wife. Jacob heard that Shechem had defiled Dinah, his daughter. Now his sons were with his cattle in the field, and Jacob held his peace until they were come. And Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out unto Jacob to commune with him. And the sons of Jacob came out of the field when they heard it. And the men were grieved and very wroth or angry, because he had wrought folly in Israel in lying with Jacob's daughter, which thing ought not to be done. And Hamor communed with them, saying, The soul of my son Shechem longeth for your daughter. I pray you, give him to wife, and make marriages with us, and give your daughters to us, and take our daughters to you. And you will dwell with us, and the land will be before you. Dwell and trade therein, and get you possessions therein. And Shechem said unto his father and to her brothers, Let me find grace in your eyes, and what you shall say to me I will give. Ask me never so much dowry and gift, and I will give, according as you shall say to me, but give me the damsel to wife. Can I just say here that life near Shechem, the city of Shechem, introduced Jacob's family to its ungodliness. Here's Jacob's daughter, and she's just doing what people do. She goes out and she starts making friends with the daughters of the land. She's just interacting, having fellowship with them. Normal activity, nothing wrong there. But in the process of time, it causes Shechem, Hamor's son, to notice her. And you read this story, and it's really hard to read, isn't it? Shechem's treated Dinah in the manner of the ungodly. I don't think his actions were necessarily malicious. It certainly reads initially as if it was. Forgive me if you disagree with this assessment, and I understand if you do, but I think there's no question that Dinah is horribly abused here by this young man. And by extension, her family suffered. And the language is really gritty and it's really dark. But did you notice that Shechem desires to marry her and even declares his love for her? And Moses, who wrote Genesis, says in verse 3 that Shechem apparently did have genuine feelings for Dinah. His soul cleaved to her, desired her. And that same word cleave is the past referenced in chapter 2 and verse 24 when God through Moses said, a man will leave his father and mother and will cleave unto his wife. It's the same language. So this is the idea. He's saying, I really want to live my life with her. It says that he loved her and he even spoke kindly to her. These are heart words. This is some sort of romance. And I know that you read this story and you say, there's no romance in this story at all. And here's what I'm going to tell you. In his mind, I think there was. And that's what's warped and twisted about it. The ungodly look at the pure, beautiful things of life and they twist them around and they turn them to be sinister and ugly. I mean, you look at the way our culture is perverting marriage. It's perverting it. So that right now there are people who I'm assuming are reasonably sane people. And I'm saying this a little sarcastically, you understand, okay? Because what they are saying is insane. That boys should go into girls' restrooms or compete in girls' sports. And I can even tell by how quiet it is in here that this has been so politicized, you're a little embarrassed to even think about this. Friends, it's the Word of God. And we shouldn't be embarrassed to speak up and say, God made male and female, right? Did he not? And if you don't believe that, then ultimately you don't believe this book, and ultimately you don't believe God himself. And how dare we as believers back away from that truth? Now, we can say it compassionately and in love. But it's insane. Our culture is twisting marriage, perverting it, making it ugly, something that God declared to be beautiful. That's what our culture does. And in this case, I think that's what Shechem is doing. He's just being a Canaanite. Can we all just realize that? That's what he is. He's just a Canaanite. We could almost make that a pejorative, an insult. You're such a Canaanite. He's just being a Canaanite. He would have treated any of the Canaanite women this way, I imagine. That's what Canaanite people do. But I think he does love her and does care about her. Now, Hamar's goal is complete assimilation of Jacob's family. Do you see what he says? When this situation occurs, Hamor offers Jacob to intermarry and to join his family. And this may have afforded Jacob some stability. It would have destroyed his distinction, though, based on the covenant. If Jacob intermarries, if his family joins up with Hamor and all of these people living in this city of Shechem in Shalem, they would have become, verse 22 says, one people. One people. No longer would Jacob have been God's people. Remember what his altar is? God is the God of Israel. Now you would have had some sort of amalgamation, some sort of mixture of pagan and God. It would have been awful and terrible, that kind of religious syncretism that you find later in the kingdom, where they're trying to bring in these gods of the people and blend it in with the God Jehovah. This kind of wickedness that ended up sending them into exile. The distinction of covenant would have been lost if they had become one people with these people of Shechem. But Hamor, it says in verse 20, wanted to control Jacob's wealth and gain control over it. This is his stated governmental goal. He wanted to he said, let's live in peace with them. Let's take their daughters for our wives and give them our daughters. And of course, verse 23, shall not their cattle and substance and every beast be ours? That's what he really wants. He wants Jacob's stuff to become his stuff. What Hamor is proposing, what Shechem began, all of this has one major satanic goal, and that's to destroy the people of God. And understand, friends, as we live in a world where the world itself that hates Jesus, that hates Christianity, that is twisting the beautiful things to make it ugly, as we live in that world, Satan's desire is to take God's people, the people who claim to be followers of Jesus, who call themselves Christians, and make them one with themselves. They want us to be one people with them. And we can't do it. And I'm sorry if that makes you feel a little bit like an outcast, or if it makes you feel a little uncomfortable in your job, but we can't do it. In the early church, and you start walking through some of the churches that the Apostle Paul wrote to. In the early church, he wrote to some of those churches, and he says to them, now, I know what's going on in your life. He's not saying it quite this way. I'm Americanizing it. But in cities like Corinth, the people were coming to the realization that as Christians and followers of Jesus, if they continue to practice normal life habits of Corinthian people, that they would become outcasts in their culture. They would get up and they would go to a temple, a big, beautiful arena, a temple, a building, and they would first stop down at the marketplace and buy some meat, or they would go into the temple and buy the meat, and they would give the meat over to those priests that were there. Maybe they didn't practice all the immoral activities that went on there, but they would go and they would buy that meat, and they would give that meat over to the priests and priestesses who were there. And then they would walk away and they would kind of wipe their hands and they would say, it's just meat. That's all it is. It's just meat. But in reality, the Apostle Paul says, no, it's more than that. It's meat that has been offered to an idol. And behind that idol, chapter 10 says, there's a demon. And you can't drink the cup of God, that communion cup, and the cup of devils, the cup of demons. See, the truth is, friends, is that we have been separated from the world by Jesus Christ. And so here we find Shechem's family just living life brought Jacob into a place where he ended up in this situation, truly, I think, in some ways, in no fault of his own. But the result of it was the defilement of his daughter, and worse, the temptation to leave the covenant that God had made with him and join up with the people of the land. And I think the same method is being used today by the devil to destroy God's people in our world. The devil wants us to become like everybody else. But I don't think we should. And in fact, I would say this, because we live in an ungodly world, we have to learn how to live. We must purpose. You just have to determine in your mind, I'm going to live like Jesus Christ. I'm going to be Christ-like in an ungodly world. This is point number 2. We should live like Christ, or live Christ-like, in our ungodly world, which means do not respond to ungodliness in a sinful way. You see in verse 13, all the way down through verse 31, what you find the rest of the story is Jacob's sons responding to ungodliness in an ungodly way. The solution to the problems I mentioned earlier, the questions of gender and marriage, is not political. The solutions are spiritual, which is why we don't go to governmental agencies. We don't go to people in power and just let them have it. We go and we share our faith with them. We want to help them. We want to teach them about Jesus. And here we learn we should live like Christ in an ungodly world by not responding to godliness in a sinful way. And you read what happens here in verse 13. So the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor, his father, deceitfully. Well, there's our first problem. And said, because he had defiled Dinah, their sister, they said to them, we can't do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that's a reproach to us, but this we will consent. If you will be as we, and every male be circumcised, then we will give our daughters to you. You take our daughters to us, and we will dwell with you and become one people. There's the lie. But if you will not hearken to us to be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and we will be gone. And their words pleased Hamor, Shechem, Hamor's son. And the young man deferred not to do the thing because he had delight. He didn't put it off, in other words, because he had delight in Jacob's daughter, and he was more honorable than all the house of Jacob, or the house of his father, rather. And Hamor and Shechem, his son, came to the gate of their city and communed with the men of their city, saying, these men are at peace with us. Let us dwell with them. Let them dwell in our land and trade therein. For the land, behold, is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters for us to wives, and let us give them our daughters only. Herein will the men consent to be one people, right? See, that's the whole line of reasoning. How can we become one? If every male among us be circumcised as they are circumcised, shall not their cattle and substance and every beast of theirs be ours? Only let us consent unto them, and they will dwell with us. And unto Hamor and Shechem his son hearkened all they that went out of the gate of the city, and every male was circumcised, all that went out of the gate of the city. And it came to pass on the third day, when they were sore, the two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, that's son number 2 and son number 3. Reuben's number 1. Here's sons number 2 and 3. Dinah's brothers each took his sword and came upon the city boldly and slew all the males. And they slew Hamor and Shechem his son with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went out. And the sons of Jacob came upon the slain and spoiled the city because they had defiled their sister. And they took their sheep and their oxen and their donkeys and everything that's in the city and everything that was in the field and all their wealth and their little ones, their children, and their wives they took captive and spoiled all that was in their house. And Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you have troubled me to cause me to stink among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And I being few in number, they shall gather themselves together against me and slay me, and I shall be destroyed, I and my house. And they said to their dad, should he deal with our sister as with a prostitute? Now, this is the response. And I'm going to tell you, it's all wrong. Instead of bringing godliness to this ungodly situation, they compound the problem by bringing more ungodliness to an ungodly situation, because it begins with flat-out manipulation. Jacob's sons agree in principle. Yes, we'll become one people with you. But they make false demands with false promises. Well, if we're going to do that, then really what has to happen here is every single one of you men, you all have to become circumcised. That's the only way that we can join up with you. And they promised that they would join them if they did this. And this is just lying and deceit. And I'm going to tell you something, friends. In an ungodly world, when we are surrounded by ungodly people that are pulling us to become like themselves, we become like them when we use the same tactics that they're using against us, against them. When we lie to them, when we manipulate them to somehow get our way, to get the result that we want, then we're really acting no better than they are. And that's what you see happening here. Now, I'll just say to you straight out, this is another reason why I think Hamor, or Shechem, rather, really does love Dinah. Because he's willing to go through this. And without being graphic, you all understand what we're talking about when we talk about circumcision. This is kind of difficult. And then I think, why would all the men of the city, they must have been so covetous of Jacob's wealth. Of course, he was an extremely wealthy man. He had huge flocks and herds. They must have been so willing to just jump through these hoops and be willing to do these horrible things to themselves, mutilate themselves in this fashion, not for godly reasons, but for ungodly reasons. And all of this just leads me to think to myself, they were willing to do this because they wanted all of this. There's just so much sin in this passage. The Canaanites are sinning, and the sons of Jacob are sinning. Everybody's just living in this horrible cycle of sin. And even worse, after manipulating these people, well, murder is not the right response to violence. Because that's what they do. Simeon and Levi committed genocide against the city of Shechem and its people. They murder all the men, and they take the children and their wives as their slaves. Captive, that's what it means. They become slaves to the families of Jacob. These little children grow up in slavery. The wives are now enslaved in the families of Jacob, or these sons. Just you take her and you take him and you can have these kids over there. And really everything that's going on here is just pagan. And it just reminds us that this is not how Jesus was at all. A bruised reed he will not break. He doesn't cry in the streets. Jesus had a sweet and gentle spirit about him. And it just reminds me that when we deal with ungodly people in our culture, living among them, we can't respond in kind. I have this kind of funny habit sometimes. A car will drive up next to us at a stoplight. And the guy has the window down, and he's playing whatever station it is, and it's really loud. And I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear his music. So what I do is I turn it to the classical station, and I turn it way up. Way up. We did this a few years ago. We were in Raleigh at a park. These young adults had their station on. The whole car is just bouncing, And I had on the classical station. And when they caught wind of it, they turned theirs down, and it just cracked them up. And both my children, they were in high school at the time. You wouldn't have known they were in the car because they ducked all the way down. They did not want to be seen with this crazy dad who's playing some classical piece really loud. Well, that's a joke, right? But how many times as believers have we been tempted to respond in kind with people when they mistreat us? When they hurt us? Isn't it kind of our nature to want to hurt them back? I had a Christian friend who used to jokingly say, I don't get even, I escalate. And I know Christians who really are that way. They make it worse instead of making it better. Neighbor is out at night talking loudly, getting drunk, doing all sorts of things outside, and you're trying to sleep, and it's late at night, and in this area, for most of us, our houses are so close together, you almost live in each other's living rooms, So you know what's going on. And it's not something you want your kids to hear. You don't want to hear it yourself, and it's just kind of ugly and yuck. And how do you respond? You call the police on them. They're violating the noise ordinance. Let's get the police out here. That's what I want to do in my flesh. But I don't believe that's how Jesus would respond. You see, remember what Peter wrote about Jesus. When he was reviled, what did he do? He reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not. That was Jesus' response. When they were nailing his hands to a cross, he was praying a prayer, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And in our culture, when our children or in our job or in our community, when we bump up against this kind of ungodliness, that's abusive. It doesn't have to be as abusive as this text, but it's abusive. And it's difficult and it's ugly. Instead of responding angrily or in our flesh, we respond with Christ and with his cross and with grace. And we say to these people, I love you in the Lord. And I want to share with you the good news of Jesus. Friends, there's an anger in Christianity right now that's really disturbing. And I understand it. This twisting and the perverting that our culture is doing of all the things that are normal can easily make us angry, can it not? And in a righteous sense, we have a right to be angry, in a righteous sense. But it doesn't mean we respond with anger. It means we respond with Christian love. It means we speak to school board members with sweet, gentle words that encourage them to change their ways, instead of threatening to do horrible things to them. And I know they just had a hearing about this in Washington, D.C. And one of the senators on the more liberal side said, I just typed into Google threats against school board members. And I heard him say that. I said, I think I'll do that, threats against school board members. And he said, a bunch of things popped up. And do you know what happens when I typed it into the internet? A whole bunch of things popped up of people, school board members, who were having their lives threatened because of decisions they'd made. Their decisions were wrong. In some cases, really wrong and wicked. But that's not the answer. The answer isn't to say, we're going to deceive you, we're going to manipulate you, even murder you. The answer is, we're going to bring Christ to you. We're going to bring love to you. A number of years ago, there was a group of people out in front of the college where I went to school, the Bible college, and they were protesting one of these issues that I've already talked about. They were protesting and they were making a lot of noise. And it was a hot day. And so one of the Bible teachers went over to Sam's Club or Costco and bought a whole bunch of water. And you know what he did? He went out to this group protesting and said, here, have some water. Would you like to have some water? Would you like water? Here, have some water. You're probably getting parched from all the yelling. Here's some water. What a sweet Christ-like response. And that's what changes people's minds and hearts. Murder is not the right response to violence, and lying is not the right response to manipulation. It's to bring Jesus. You see, and that's really what we're talking about, because, friends, this is letter B. We should show forth our Christian testimony before others. So here we have in chapter 35 kind of the end of the story. The story that began in chapter 33 at the very end concludes in chapter 35 with all this ugliness in the middle. It concludes, God said to Jacob, okay, you need to leave that place and you need to get to Bethel. And I think if you go back a few chapters, you find that God has been leading Jacob to Bethel for a long time, for a while. There's time in the middle of these chapters that you kind of can't read because they're pushed together, they're smooshed together because you're reading through the Bible chapter to chapter. But there's time here. It takes time to build a house and build a farm, right? It takes time to buy land and build another house and build an altar. So there's time here stretched out. But God has been leading Jacob back to Bethel. And what does Bethel mean? Bethel, Beth El. El is God, Elohim. And Beth is house. It's the house of God. God is leading them back to his house. Go to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to me, to God, who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau, your brother. And Jacob said to his household and to all that were with him, put away the strange gods among you and be clean and change your garments. And now arise and go to Bethel, and I will make an altar unto God. So here's Jacob being commanded by God to do something, and he openly obeys the commands of God in verse 1 to relocate to Bethel. This is another move. And moving in our world is difficult enough. Moving in the ancient world is really hard. There's no Mayflower movers to call. There aren't two men with a truck to call. You have to do it yourself. And so you've got to strike all the tents. You've got to gather up all the oxen and the sheep and the donkeys. And you've got to get your whole family together. Everybody is going to move together, and they're all going to move here miles away. And this is difficult. It's hard. You're talking, in this case, some 35 miles maybe he's moving. Well, when was the last time you walked 35 miles straight? Last time I was at Disney World. No, I mean, in an unpleasant kind of manner. When was the last time you walked 35 miles? You walk and you walk and you walk, and the children have to stop, because that's what children do, right? They, just as you get going, they're one of Reuben's kids going, grandkids going, hey, I gotta stop. And the whole caravan comes to a halt. He runs off into the woods. You know, I mean, this is just life. They're doing this. This is what they're doing. And they're moving. And it takes time and effort and energy, but he obeys. And I'm just going to tell you, the natural response to God saying you need to move is probably not, I'm so excited about moving, but instead it's immediate, open obedience. Jacob goes right to his family and says, this is what we're doing. We're all moving to Bethel. You see that in verse 6. This is exactly what he does. Jacob came to Luz, which is in the land of Canaan, that is Bethel, he and all the people with him. And he built there an altar. He's reestablishing himself in the land. And with open obedience comes open worship. He's building an altar there for worship. He's obeying the command of the second part of verse 1. I'm going to keep living for God. I'm going to openly follow him, openly serve him, and I'm going to let everybody know this is who I am. I am a follower of Jehovah. I am not one people with the Shechemites. I'm not going to become part of the Canaanite culture. We're going to separate ourselves out of that, and we're going to live for God in an ungodly world. And he builds there an altar and purifies his house from idols. And this is, I think, so important to understand that this is not just idolatry here, but this is just common worldly practice. And part of Jacob's building an altar to God for worship is saying, I'm not going to have any of this worldliness in our lives at this point. Let's just get rid of all of it, and let's just be clean before God. And Jacob does it. Now, friends, I'm just going to tell you something here, and I think it's really important that you understand, is that living in an ungodly world in a godly way is not just saying I won't respond in kind when people hurt me, but rather it's proactive and it's positive and it's beneficial. I'm going to live like Christ in this world. It's Daniel praying every day, even when the command was not to pray. It's his refusing to defile himself with a portion of the king's meat or with the wine that he drank. It's actually saying we're going to separate ourselves from worldliness, not the world. Paul says you can't even do that in chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians. He says you can't get out of the world. To leave the world means to die. That's the only way you can leave the world. We're in this world. This is our world. We live in the Research Triangle Park of North Carolina. That's where we live. I mean, you can move, but where are you going to go? It's going to get you out of the world. Even if you move to No Place, Montana, or Nowhere, Nevada, or you go to Wake Forest. I was just in Wake Forest yesterday in a house where a lady had 60 cats. My allergies still aren't right. Really, it was unbelievable. But you can go in the middle of nowhere and you're still in the world. You're still there. I mean, that guy, the Unabomber, he tried to get out of the world. They eventually found him, right? You can't get out of this world. This is the world in which you live. It's with you all the time. And I'm just reminded just this very second, we even keep the world in our pockets. Strapped to our hip. So instead of responding in kind, we have to be positive and proactive and say, okay, I'm going to openly obey God in this world. I'm going to do what God wants me to do in this world. And I'm going to openly worship God in this world. And it may seem weird to the people around me, and friends, it's getting weirder to them. Our lives to them, I read it every week, how strange they think we are. They look at us, we are the wackiest, weirdest people on the planet to them. Well, I think the same way about them, so. And it's getting weirder. But what are we going to do? We're going to openly worship God in front of them. I have a God. He made everything. He revealed himself to me in his word. He saved me by dying on a cross for my sins. And I love him. And I'm going to serve him as long as I live in this world, on this planet. And that's what God is calling us to do. The world is pulling you toward itself really hard. But God is pulling in the other direction. When I was a boy, we played tug of war. You don't really see it played much anymore, I guess. All the old games are out. There was this lady with her little daughter the other day walking down the sidewalk, and they were walking right toward us, and they weren't paying any attention, and I was going to run into them. And so when they were about 5 feet away, I said, "Red Rover, Red Rover." Because we were just going to bust right through the line, you know. Some of you are thinking, what in the world is he talking about? Well, there was this game, you held hands in grade school, and then you said, Red Rover, and you sent the littlest puny girl. I'm sorry, that's the way it was, And this girl who was about 2.5 feet tall and weighed about 40 pounds, she'd try to run through and bust through this line, throw her whole 40-pound body at the line, whatever, and, and bounce off. And that was right. And I said it, and the mom immediately smiled, and then she broke hands with her daughter because they were just right in the middle of the sidewalk. I mean, pick a lane, but right in the middle. And she smiled and she said, "I used to play that." We don't play these games, but there was a boy named David, and he was hefty. He was strong, and he was big, and he was hefty. And everybody wanted David on their team when we played tug of war. Not for races, but for tug of war. And the two captains would line everybody up against the fence, and begins the humiliation of children, because you're picking. I don't, everybody knows, don't pick him, don't pick her. So it's pick, and the whole poor person's left. Well, David in tug of war was picked first every time. Do you know why? Because what he would do is he would wrap that rope around his waist, and he would sit down, and nobody was moving him. He was unmovable. Unmovable. All the little kids on the other side are yanking their arms out of their sockets, trying to get David to move, and it was impossible. He would never move. And after they would tire themselves enough, just a little bit of gentle tugging, and that rope, and that handkerchief would come over to our side, and we would win. And so then David, he is the giant. He is the giant of tug of war. And everybody wanted him on their team. And my friends, greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. We have a David on our team. His name is Jesus. And we follow his example to be like him in a world that is so ungodly, because that's what God wants us to do. And that's how you win the game. You have Jesus on your team. And you pull the rope for him.